We know that Insidious's Keyface demon has been around haunting the cell blocks of Dubend State Penitentiary since at least 1953, but it's likely that his history goes back much deeper than that. As a child, psychic medium Elise Rainier encountered spirits of many who had died in the prison, but stuck around to haunt the place and the grounds surrounding it.
There's so many spirits in this house, it's hard to tell the good from the evil. A lot of people died in that prison.
Part of the reason there are so many spirits has to do with the execution site being located on property. Dubend is most likely a stand-in for a real prison, Penitentiary of New Mexico, which opened in 1885 and contained a now defunct gas chamber for executions, which along with other incidents gave the place a reputation of being haunted. So it's likely that this is around the time Keyface first started showing up, the late 1800s. To learn why this evil creature came to develop this terrifying look, where he fits into the hierarchy of insidious entities, and what this character truly represents, stick around to the end of this video. This video is sponsored by Factor. Welcome to Horror History. I'm gonna need everyone to turn around, please, and put your hands on the wall. Now, where did I put that whooping stick? In today's video, I am analyzing the antagonist of Insidious: The Last Key, which is the fourth chapter of the Insidious franchise. They call him Keyface, which doesn't really make sense to me. Clearly the keys are on his fingers, not his face. Maybe they were trying to name this character in such a way that it would remind people of Redface, the poster boy of Insidious antagonists. Or maybe it has something to do with this early piece of concept art where the skin around his nose and mouth is absent, forming a kind of lock shape. But that does come with its own question. Why wouldn't they just call him Lockface? But etymology aside, Keyface was played by Javier Botet, who is known for his roles as lanky, disjointed horror creatures, like the leper in It, the crooked man in The Conjuring 2, and the big toe monster in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, all of which are side villains, so it's nice to finally get to talk about one of his roles as the main bad guy. But to fully understand why this demon haunted and disturbed the ghost hunting hero Elise Rainier more than any other, we've got to take it back to his earliest victims at the Dubend Penitentiary. Keyface, like other demons of Insidious lore, takes on an appearance to appeal to those that he's trying to capture. I've previously analyzed other entities and discussed how their form factor is meant to lure their victims into the further. Insidious director James Wan stated that the red-faced demon was originally meant to lure curious children in with his bright colors and almost carnival-esque appearance. The man who can't breathe from Insidious Chapter 3 appeared as a sickly man in order to garner sympathy from victims and remind them of someone they know who had suffered, which is why Quinn Brenner lets her guard down around the demon after losing her mom. Keyface's victims are all prisoners at the penitentiary. His goal is to drag them into an even worse kind of captivity in the confines of the purgatory realm known as the Further. He appeals to them with his appearance by taking a form that teases the promise of freedom. With his keys for fingers, he almost looks like he could be a mischievous spirit who could let the prisoners out. He also has long, unkempt hair, a clear sign that he could be on their side, as opposed to the prison staff who have strict requirements to maintain short, neatly groomed hairstyles. Keyface was first granted access to the real world in September of 1953, when Elise Rainier, daughter of the prison's assistant warden, Gerald Rainier, is locked in the basement as punishment for using her psychic abilities to communicate with one of the many ghosts on the property. Keyface uses a childlike voice to get her attention and shines a light through the keyhole of the door in the basement to try to quell her fear. Each demonic entity in the Further resides behind a red door, but since Elise is a medium, she can see the door in the real world, just as she can often see spirits in her world. Keyface uses the voice to tell her to open this door with a key hanging on the wall and explains that she's the only one that can help open all the doors. This is because Elise's father and brother clearly don't have the same ability that she does, and her mom, if she possesses any psychic ability, is afraid to use it and probably mature enough to know better than to help a strange voice. However, when Elise unlocks the door, it spits out the key, which now takes on a fleshy appearance. Elise watches in horror as Keyface reaches out and the key reattaches itself as one of his fingers. We see sparks as Keyface touches the doorknob, which I'll explain in a little bit. His newfound access to the real world also allows Elise to enter the Further for the first time, causing her eyes to roll back in her head as the entire house shakes. When her mother comes down to respond to the commotion, she finds Elise convulsing and hyperventilating in the corner, and Keyface influences a loose wire to wrap around her neck and hangs her where she stands. I don't know if Mrs. Rainier had the same abilities as Elise, but if she did, I can see why Keyface wanted to get rid of her first. Her death causes the already abusive father, Gerald, to become even worse, which is exactly what Keyface wants, because he literally thrives off of it.
Fear and pain is what feeds them.
Over the next 8 years, he would use that fear and pain to control Gerald's actions.
Daddy doesn't mean it when he yells at me. He's scared of the man with the keys. He's the one controlling it all. He's the one who opens all the doors.
In Insidious Chapter 3, Elise explains that there are two types of demons, those who want to possess the bodies of the living, like Redface, and those who just want the souls of the living to join it in the shadows, like the man who can't breathe. Based on the fact that Keyface operates out of a prison block and aims to capture as many people as possible, he seems to fall into the second category. Keyface excels at controlling their actions, using their fear of him to make them do what he wants. After Elise lets him into the world of the living, he forces Elise's father to become a kidnapper, and he secretly takes several women as prisoners in the extra room in his basement. After killing them, they become permanent prisoners when Keyface traps their souls in the further. So there are many layers at play here. Gerald works at a prison, keeps prisoners at home, and is a prisoner of the demon's control over him. Later, the suitcases of the women he kidnapped are discovered in an air duct in the basement. The sixth, and presumably final victim, was a waitress named Anna. In the early 1960s, she used a loose nail to escape from the room she was captive in and made it upstairs, where she came face to face with a now teenage Elise. Only problem was Elise was so used to seeing ghosts, and Anna, dirty, pale, and malnourished from her time in captivity, kind of looked a bit ghastly, like me after a long editing session. Because of this, Mr. Rainier was able to gaslight his daughter into thinking that Anna was just another ghost, and this leads to a fight where Elise runs away from home. This allows Gerald to go back and kill Anna without being discovered. I'm not sure what Elise's brother, Christian, was doing at the time, but it's possible that he was distracted by his distress over his sister abandoning the family. At some point when he was old enough, Christian got out himself, and with nobody left to torture, Keyface took Gerald's life, and he became a ghost in the further. Historically, the ghosts of the further tend to maintain the appearance of the age that they died at, and Gerald's ghost looks to be about 15 to 20 years older than he was in 1953, so we can assume that Keyface killed him in the 1960s or 1970s and took his ghost as one of his prisoners. The house sat vacant for about 40 years, until a single man named Ted Garza dumped his life savings into buying the house, which turned out to be as poor of a personal choice as it was a poor real estate investment, as he became the next to be haunted by the demon known as Keyface. Fans of my channel know I love getting my meals from Factor because of how much time it saves me. But just how much time is that? Let's break it down. Choosing a meal. Whether that's browsing delivery apps or looking for recipes, it ends up being about 10 minutes of comparing options. Going to the store and buying ingredients is probably a 30-minute trip for me, but I usually order my groceries online, so let's just call this 15 minutes. Preparing the meal. This is obviously going to vary from recipe to recipe, but between cutting, portioning, and preheating, this is usually another 10 minutes, and that's being generous. Cooking the meal. Again, this will probably depend on what you make, but I'll be generous again and say that a really quick meal takes like 25 minutes. And let's not forget when you're making your own meal, you have to do the dishes and clean up. That's another 10 minutes at least. Add it all up, and that's 65 minutes on a good day. Factor takes 2. You put it in the microwave, you press 2, and you're all set. Which means you can save at least 63 minutes a day by using Factor. Factor also offers Gourmet Plus meals as part of your weekly options whenever you're craving something special. I'm always impressed with how they never taste dry or tough after a trip through the microwave. Factor is now owned by HelloFresh, so CZsWorld viewers can enjoy both brands with my discount. To get started with Factor, go to factor75.com, click the link below, and use code CZ50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. That's factor75.com and use code CZ50 for 50% off. After making contact with the house's newest inhabitant, Ted Garza, Keyface forces him to kidnap a nurse from nearby and lock her in the basement for 4 months, continuing the cycle of abduction that he started with Gerald.
I think it made Ted Garza do what he did.
But unlike Gerald, Ted seems slightly more resistant and tries to take action to get rid of the disturbance from his home. Eventually, in 2010, he considers calling Elise's company, Spectral Sightings, to investigate, which really shows how desperate he must have been. Bringing in ghost hunters would make it pretty likely that his prisoner would be discovered. Then again, if Keyface was controlling him, maybe that's what he wanted to happen. Maybe bringing Elise back into the fold was part of the plan for Keyface to finally imprison the one that got away. But in the 40-something years since Elise's departure, she's buried a lot of her old memories due to the trauma that she experienced from her father. She's essentially forgotten about Keyface in her elder years. But as Keyface takes a stronger and stronger hold on Ted Garza, Elise begins having nightmares about Keyface again, and sketches him inside of her book of seeing. These nightmares consist of scenes from her childhood, and as these memories slowly come back, she fills in more of the picture. After one nightmare about her childhood, she writes down, "Give me the key."
The dreams are coming back, Warren. Just won't go away, will it?
Screenwriter Lee Winnell expanded on how he created the demon as a manifestation for what Elise is going through.
The demon really represents the trauma that has affected Elise her whole life. And this demon who has keys for fingers has the power to lock and unlock these doors into Elise's past.
I think if we read between the lines here, Keyface is not just literally unlocking these portals in the further, but the keys represent him unlocking memories that bring back up the trauma. In psychology, this is known as triggering, a stimulus that causes a painful memory to resurface. It could be a sound, sight, smell, any other sensory experience, or even another memory. The reason for this is because the brain is a literal neural network, so as one part of the brain gets fired up, it'll also activate the neurons connected to that part. Neurophysicist Donald Hebb used the term neurons that fire together wire together. The concept is often seen in children who have suffered abuse. Oftentimes, any physical contact, good or bad, will trigger a fight or flight response because it triggers memories of the abuse. At the beginning, Elise doesn't seem to fully remember everything that went down, but the trauma comes back to her through her dreams and eventually through revisiting her childhood home. A trauma victim might even refer to this process as unlocking old memories, much like how you might unlock memories in a video game. The first night at the old house, Elise stays in her old room where most of the supernatural activity is focused, and a ghostly figure sneaks up on her. But when she turns, she sees her dad's old uniform. I believe that this was Keyface, because when she goes to touch the set of keys in the jacket pocket, she gets a little static shock, just like what we saw when Keyface touched the doorknob in her childhood. There are also other examples of Keyface having a shock to the touch going forward. Like his other attributes, I think there's symbolism here as well. Static electricity can be built up when materials rub together, causing electrons to build up in an object. When you touch that object, you may get a static shock. You can't see the electrons when they're built up on the surface, but they are there, waiting to be accessed. It's a lot like how Elise represses her painful childhood memories, but when she revisits the house and comes across Keyface, the memories rush back, and she's in for a painful shock. Eventually, Anna's ghost helps Elise discover Garza's human prisoner and save her while she's still alive. When Garza retaliates, one of Elise's employees, Specs, is forced to trap him under a bookcase, which ultimately ends up killing him. Keyface needs a new target and finds one when Elise's nieces, no rhyme intended, Melissa and Imogen, visit the house to help Christian search for a whistle given to him by his mom before she died. Melissa searches the basement and finds several rings of keys, but after seeing one of them move on their own, discovers that they're actually connected to the hand of a demon, who easily slaps her across the room, drawing blood. Then, from another part of the basement, he crawls toward her and sticks the key extending from his index finger into her throat, allowing him to lock her vocal cords, effectively putting her on mute. Then, he inserts another key into her chest and locks her heart as well, which effectively puts her into a coma in the real world, and imprisons her spirits in the further. It ties back to this sign seen when Elise and company first arrive at her hometown in New Mexico. It says, "Welcome to 5 keys, we'll unlock your heart." That's exactly what they'd have to do to save Melissa. By what I assume is a crazy coincidence, the actress that plays Melissa is named Spencer Locke. Or maybe there was some subconscious association going on during the casting process. Anyway, she's transferred to the hospital, so Elise and Tucker continue to investigate and find the air duct containing the suitcases of all the abducted women. Only one of them contains some extra baggage. This drags Elise into the further, where she sees more scenes of her past and risks paradoxy by speaking to her younger self, encouraging her to never be afraid of her ability. Keyface doesn't like the two Elises co-conspiring, however, and attacks the older version from behind before putting her in a cage, which is in a jail cell. Kinda redundant. She's one of many prisoners, stretching back as far as the eye can see. This means Keyface likely has more prisoners in the dark than the Man Who Can't Breathe and Redface combined. Each cell is themed to an area relevant to that person. Elise's is her childhood room where she was abused. Her father's cell is the room with the TV where he spent all of his free time. Keyface unlocks their cells, but instead of attacking them himself, he simply hands Elise her dad's old cane, hoping to see Elise's anger overcome her and get revenge on her abusive dad. Remember, fear and pain is what feeds him, which makes him more of a psychological horror than his red and blue counterparts. Insidious The Last Key director Adam Robitel touched on this a little bit in an interview with Collider. I really felt like if you're gonna make a movie about Elise's origin story, she's sort of like a superhero. She's not really afraid of ghosts, so you need something that really scares her. How do you do that? Well, you play into her psychology. You play on the thing that she hates the most, which is this relationship with her father. At first, she falls for it and repeatedly whacks him with the cane just as he once did to her. And we see the effect in real time. It seems to exhilarate Keyface and maybe even give him some power. As Elise beats down Gerald, there's a quick intercut shot of Gerald, in turn, abusing Anna, the captured woman in the 1960s. The further is a realm capable of connecting different points in time, so it seems to suggest that Keyface is simply using Elise's rage and channeling it to her father. That raises the question of how time travel works in this universe. It seems to be the Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban model, where those who travel back in time have always traveled back in time. This means that they can't change their destiny. There are infinite versions of Elise scattered through different points in time, and they will all follow the same path. Even when our Elise was a child, she still spoke to the older Elise in the Further, even though that had not happened yet. It seems to be that she forgets about this encounter over the years, allowing it to happen at this point in time over and over again. We saw something similar happen in Insidious Chapter 2, when Josh Lambert was the one to set off the burglar alarm in his house during the events of the first Insidious. The result of this is the dark truth that Elise's inability to control her rage resulted in the death of the waitress Anna in the past, and there's nothing she can do to change her destiny. However, she soon realizes that her hatred is feeding the demon, setting up a confrontation 57 years in the making. After discovering Elise had, like Melissa, fallen into a coma, Elise's other niece, Imogen, revealed that she too has the ability to see the spirits and volunteered to venture into the Further herself to hopefully rescue her distressed family members. She goes to Keyface's lair beyond the Red Door, the cell block where he keeps all of his prisoners, and sees him slam Elise back into captivity. Then he sets his sights on Imogen. Although Elise is able to just telepathically free herself, I'm not sure why she didn't use this earlier, Keyface reappears with both nieces now in captivity. Elise offers to give herself up, bartering for the demon to let them go, but then Keyface just brutally bitch slaps her across the room. I actually kind of appreciate this guy for being the one demon in any of these 2010s paranormal horror movies that'll actually just smack his enemies instead of air-eating them. Especially when you consider that The Last Key was directed by Adam Robitel, a former Paranormal Activity director. I imagine that getting slapped across the room is more painful too. I assume getting air-yeeted feels something like a good launch coaster. It's shocking, but it's not really something that hurts. Whereas getting smacked by Keyface would be a lot like riding Green Lantern First Flight. You're definitely gonna be walking out of there with some bruises. And that's not the only damage that Keyface dishes out. He stabs Melissa in the back, causing her to writhe and convulse in the real world, where she begins to flatline. Using some kind of speed ability, he tries to bum rush Elise, but to her surprise, her father's ghost comes to her defense, and Keyface eliminates him with a single stab, causing him to just dissipate from the Further. After all this time of being afraid of Keyface and caving into his evil demands, I'm not really sure what made Gerald finally stand up to his captor. If I had to guess, he simply saw this as his best opportunity to escape, but perhaps he also felt guilty after seeing Elise take mercy on him and decided to actually help her out for once. However, he's only a minor setback for the powerful Keyface, whose roar knocks Elise to the ground. He tries to do to her what he did to Melissa and Imogen by locking her vocal cords, but Imogen realizes there's one thing she can do without using her voice, and tosses Elise the whistle. This whistle was once given to Christian as a way to call his mother if he was ever afraid. As the demon goes for her heart, Elise stabs it in the face, giving her a moment's time to retrieve and sound the whistle. Just as it had in her youth, it summons her mother, who still lives in the Further as a spirit, and fearlessly confronts the monster.
Hands off my little girl.
Keyface charges, but Mrs. Rainier issues an explosion of light from her lantern to send the creature blasting off into the dark. And if you look closely, the attack seems to burn right through his body as well, which seems to suggest that the ancient keykeeper of the Dubend Penitentiary is defeated once and for all. It makes sense that this antagonist, who represents the trauma Elise incurred during her childhood, is destroyed shortly after the demise of Gerald, the one who physically dished out that trauma. And he's defeated by Elise's mom, the one person who always tried to stand up for Elise against her father. There's one thing I have to address because I know people are gonna bring it up. In the Blu-ray special feature, Unlocking the 5 Keys, executive producer Bailey Conway Anglewitz offers a different account of Keyface's history.
This is in Elise's childhood home, and it's a big house on the prison property. Her father was the assistant warden of the prison. Keyface was a very old prisoner who was wronged, and that's why he haunts this property.
This isn't part of the movie itself, so I don't really consider it canon, and there are several problems with this statement. She says Keyface was an old prisoner who was wronged. There's no evidence of that in the movie, and he's specifically referred to as a demon multiple times. We know that demons are non-human entities. If you saw my Man Who Can't Breathe video, you may remember that there was a similar mix-up regarding that character. And Bailey Conway Anglewitz is the executive producer. While executive producer roles can vary in how involved they are, she's essentially the person who funds the movie, so she may not be the definitive source on lore-related stuff. I do appreciate that she has CZ in her name though. Someone who is more definitive regarding lore would be the writer, Lee Winnell, who clearly refers to both the Man Who Can't Breathe and Keyface as demons.
The demon really represents the trauma that has affected Elise her whole life.
And Keyface really does seem to affect Elise in a much more personal way than even a more powerful demon like Redface. When dealing with Redface, she certainly seems intimidated and concerned, but with Keyface, it's personal. In one deleted scene, the demon locks her in this room in her house, and she starts crying and feels helpless, turning her into the little girl once locked in the basement by her father. That's why I introduced Keyface the way I did at the beginning of this video. Even if he doesn't possess the raw power of Redface or the diverse subset of abilities as the Man Who Can't Breathe, it is Keyface's psychological aspects that allowed him to haunt and disturb the usually stoic hero more than any other. And if you haven't seen my analysis of those other Insidious spirits, check out that playlist on the left to see the histories of all this universe's monsters. If you love horror, make sure you subscribe to CZsWorld for new horrors every week, ring the death bell for all notifications, and I will see you in the next one, assuming we both survive.